Just how many weird and horrifying forms can the Flood parasite take in the Halo franchise? Well, given its ability to infect the bodies of most species, and the very malleable nature of the Flood, allowing it to create new forms to combat previously unencountered threats, it's nearly impossible to catalogue all the nightmarish forms that this powerful hive mind can take. But there have been a number of forms encountered in the Halo universe, all guaranteed to make your skin crawl. So let's take a look at them. Starting out with the initial infection forms. Given the success of the Flood is entirely contingent on it being able to infect new hosts, the most common of the parasite's forms, in its early stages of deluge, is the infection form. Creatures spawned in extraordinary numbers to overwhelm the local populace and convert them into carriers, tools, and food for the Flood. And whilst these infection forms are barely intelligent themselves, once they infect a host of sufficient neural complexity, they can easily use their host's mind to further the Flood's goals. The simplest of infection forms are spores, airborne carriers of the Flood infection. Spores can remain inactive for hundreds of years, patiently awaiting a host to infect and convert their biomass into Flood supercell biomass, planting eggs within the host that hatch into larger infection forms. Seeders are light-in-air infection forms that travel a planet's airspace in swarms, attacking airborne vehicles and infecting the inhabitants. Tadpoles seem to be waterborne, basic infection forms. Not much is known about these forms, however, and they could just be underdeveloped infection forms. The pod infector is the most common Flood form. While small and weak, these forms travel in huge swarms, bounding towards their prey on short tentacle legs, which it then uses in combination with its fleshy tendrils to tear away armour and burrow into a host's spine. Here the parasite rewrites the host's neural pathways, allowing it full control over the body's motor functions. It then burrows further into the host's chest cavity, releasing Flood supercells to convert the host biomass to new Flood biomass. At this point, the victim is turned into a combat or carrier form. Combat forms are a hellish mockery of what the host once was. And whilst much of the host body is converted into Flood biomass, some sensory organs or limbs are retained, in order to allow the form to use weapons, tools, and even ships. The worst part is, sometimes the host is still sentient and aware of what their body is doing, but unable to stop it. Instead, they are resigned to just cry out in pain and whimper for mercy. The combat form you're most likely to encounter is the attacker form, which are the morphed bodies of the galaxy's most prominent intelligent species. The human combat form is weak but agile, resembling the mangled body of the human that once was. Spartan combat forms are similar to regular human combat forms, except much deadlier, and they have never actually been documented, but the potential of facing one was deemed such a threat that training simulations are provided to Spartans in Flood containment fire teams on how to take down infected comrades. The standard process for dealing with these corrupted Spartans would be to withdraw all friendlies to a secure perimeter and bombard the area from orbit with Mach cannons and fusion warheads. Elite combat forms pose a significant threat due to their ability to use the host's energy shield and active camouflage. The brute combat forms are the most aggressive, yet slow, of all combat forms. Grunt and jackal combat forms do exist, however the species are often instead turned into raw biomass for the Flood to utilise. Certain non-fully sentient species are also deemed useful enough to be converted into their own unique combat forms. The Thrasher was the result of a Flood parasite infecting a large primate-type creature, utilising its size and powerful front limbs to harass vehicles. Swarm forms are the result of the Flood infecting large birds, allowing the Flood to attack enemies from the air. Bombers were another airborne Flood form that was formed from alien cephalopods that travelled the air via their large gas bladders. This form got its name thanks to its ability to incubate and drop pod infectors from above onto enemies. Now, if any of the combat forms were to sustain serious damage, or even if they were just to outlive their purpose, they would be transformed into large carrier forms. Bloated creatures whose sole purpose is to incubate and transport new infection forms. Once a flood hive has established itself on a planet, it can begin creating new, more advanced forms created out of raw biomass harvested from a world, instead of just infecting new hosts. Known as pure forms, these extensions of the flood can adapt their forms to combat whatever they face. This is best seen in the Shifter, an iteration of pure flood that transitions between 3 different configurations during combat. The first of these is the Stalker, a highly mobile iteration that can quickly traverse terrain, even on vertical surfaces. Once the Stalker configuration comes across the enemy, it usually transforms into either the Ranged configuration, which is a large pod-like creature that fixes itself to a vantage point and fires down sharp calcified spikes, or they may transform into the Tank, a hulking brutish configuration with long scythe-like arms designed for frontal assaults. Some less common pure forms include the Gaunt forms, which act as elite assassins, utilizing their whip-like arms to traverse the environment, locating key enemies, and absorbing their minds and secrets into the Flood's consciousness. The Infester, meanwhile, has a simple task. These ruthless hunters seek out enemy armor and bore into its hull, releasing spores during the process, intended to infect the vehicle's inhabitants. Spawners are highly mobile brood sacs, hanging at the back of flood assaults or roaming to new lands to release fresh sets of infection forms. Whilst the Hellion form is a large mobile hive and siege machine that is capable of incubating large numbers of smaller forms and reshaping its flesh and bone to destroy any defenses that stand in the flood's way. A step above these pure forms are the key minds, essentially acting as field commanders for the flood. These key minds are created by fusing multiple captured sentient entities together with pure flood supercells. These forms use the combined intelligence of their hosts to act as coordinators for local flood forces. And within this key mind category, there are 3 key mind war forms, specific variations tasked with going out into combat zones and commanding lesser forms. The first of these is the Juggernaut. This tentacled nasty utilizes the combined minds of its hosts to analyze and outwit enemy countermeasures, adjusting the local flood strategy accordingly. Abominations are gigantic keymind warforms that bring order and direction to lesser flood in the field. These towering nightmares are used when standard flood hives cannot be established, and the flood must stay mobile to avoid destruction. Unlike the Juggernaut, however, that prefers to avoid combat, the Abomination thrives in combat and is a formidable opponent, capable of decimating fortifications and mechanized defenses. Our last keymind warform is the Blight Stalker. These terrifying quadrupedal hunters scour conquered worlds in search of elusive sources of biomass and intelligence that may have survived the Flood's initial invasion. The Flood's expansion on a world eventually culminates into a Gravemind form, a centralized intelligence formed from captured minds and biomass that controls all lesser forms within its area of influence. Many Graveminds can exist in the galaxy at the same time, each acting as the local command point through which the shared consciousness of the Flood can exert its control. To put it basically, as this can get kind of confusing, Flood Graveminds and the forms that they control are part of one consciousness, so multiple Gravemind forms can coexist, as they are all just avatars for the overarching Gravemind Flood intelligence that has been active since the time of the Forerunners. But how is an individual Gravemind form created on a world? Well, it starts with the Flood forms capturing the most intelligent living organisms available on the world they are invading, and they then combine them all together with Flood biomass into a form known as a Proto-Gravemind, keeping its victims conscious as it slowly tortures their mind, extracting and erasing all thought and memories before it kills them. The establishment of a Proto-Gravemind signals the initial movement of a Flood infection from a feral stage, where local individual Flood forms are relatively unintelligent and disorganized, infecting worlds on instinct alone, to the coordinated stage, in which the Flood forms, having harvested intelligent beings, begin sharing one compound intelligence and start coordinating their infestation with the goal of forming a full Gravemind. They do this by feeding the Proto-Gravemind with thousands of captured sentience, allowing it to increase in size and accumulate memories and intelligence from its consumed hosts. until eventually it becomes a self-aware gravemind, connected to the greater Flood consciousness. There's also the Primordial, who was the last precursor and the creator of the Flood. In fact, the Primordial is the Flood's overarching consciousness, but that's a whole nother story for another day. Make sure to subscribe for more lore, or join our Discord where we can chat about lore, discuss your suggestions for videos, or maybe even play a game or two. Links down in the description. Catch you next time.